for. All right, good evening, church. Welcome to the final Bible study of 2020. I don't know about you, but I'm really enjoying planning the end of this year. And even though we have to say goodbye to Bible study, it's been really great to study this with you. And today is one that's really close to my heart because 2 Corinthians is a book of the Bible that's about the Christian way of life. And it tells us a lot about how we ought to behave and what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to be a disciple. And it all starts with the power of weakness. Justin, do we have a video ready to go? All right. So as we did for the first time, this is a video about what it means to read 2 Corinthians. Enjoy.
Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Even though it's called 2nd or 2 Corinthians in our Bibles, there are multiple clues within this letter that it's not the second thing he ever wrote to the church of ancient Corinth. Paul started this Jesus community in Corinth some time ago. On one of his missionary journeys, you can read the story in the book of Acts chapter 18. And after moving on, Paul got a report that things were not going well there. So he wrote the letter that we call 1 Corinthians to correct these problems. And it appears that many in the church rejected Paul's teaching in that letter and rebelled against his authority. And so we learn in this letter that Paul had followed up in person with what he calls the painful visit. And after that, he sent a letter which he says was written with anguish and tears. And so after all these measures, most, but not all of the Corinthians realized their arrogance and they apologized to Paul. They wanted to reconcile. And so Paul wrote this letter to assure them of his love and commitment. The letter's been designed with 3 main sections, each addressing a distinct topic. So Paul first finalizes his reconciliation with the Corinthians. Then in chapters 8 and 9, he addresses the topic of forgotten generosity. And in the final chapters, Paul challenges the remaining Corinthians who still reject him. Let's dive in and you'll see how it all works. So Paul opens up by thanking the God of all mercy and comfort who brought peace and encouragement to him and the Corinthians during this time of division and dispute. He acknowledges that things have been tense since this painful visit, and he makes clear he's forgiven them. He wants an open and honest relationship. But why had they rejected Paul in the first place? Well, we discover later in this letter that the Corinthians had disregarded Paul as a leader. He was poor, he earned a meager living through manual labor, he was under constant persecution and suffering, he was often homeless, and to top it off, he wasn't a very impressive public speaker. And so once the Corinthians were exposed to other, more wealthy, impressive Christian leaders, they started to think less of Paul. They were actually ashamed of him. So Paul responds first by showing that their elevation of these leaders, simply because of their wealth and eloquence, is a betrayal of Jesus. It shows a totally distorted value system. True Christian leadership, Paul says, is not about status or self-promotion. Paul depicts himself and the other apostles as captive slaves to King Jesus, who's leading them on a procession of triumph. Paul's job isn't to be impressive, but rather to point people to the one who is Jesus. He then alludes to the recent demand of the Corinthians that he provide some letters of recommendation to prove his authority and credentials. And this is ridiculous to Paul. Their church wouldn't even exist if he hadn't started it. And so he says they are his proof of genuine leadership. They are his letter of recommendation. He cleverly quotes from the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, saying that God's Spirit has written his letter of recommendation on their hearts as his new covenant people. The Corinthians shouldn't need any more proof than that. Now, the mention of the new covenant, it leads Paul into a long comparison between the old covenant between God and Israel that was mediated by Moses and the new covenant between God and the Corinthians mediated by Jesus and the Spirit. The old covenant made at Mount Sinai, it was truly glorious. It made Moses himself shine with God's glory, but that glory eventually faded. Not to mention the fact that the laws of that covenant were ineffective at truly transforming Israel. But the new covenant, by comparison, is even more glorious because the resurrected Jesus is the very glory of God and he lives on forever. And it's his Spirit that's now transforming people to become more faithful, just like Jesus himself. Now, this all sounds amazing. I mean, who doesn't want to share in God's own glory? But Paul goes on to show how the paradox of the cross turns upside down the Corinthians' ideas of glory and success. After all, Jesus' glorious exaltation as king took place through his suffering, execution, and death. On the cross, Jesus revealed God's salvation. He died for the sins of the world to reconcile people to God. But the cross does even more. It reveals God's character. He's a being of utter self-giving, suffering love that seeks the well-being of others. The cross also reveals a new cruciform way of life. And Paul's goal is that his life and ministry imitates the cross. So although his apostolic career, it's been marked by humility, suffering, by poverty, it was all to serve the Corinthians. And so when they disapprove of Paul's poverty and suffering, they disapprove of Jesus too. Paul's way of life and leadership is actually the proof that he authentically represents the crucified and risen Jesus. Paul really wants to reconcile with the Corinthians, but he won't let things lie until they've been transformed and embrace this upside-down paradox of the cross. After this passionate appeal, Paul moves on to address the topic of forgotten generosity. So the Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem, they had fallen into poverty due to a famine. And Paul was raising money among the new churches that he started, full of mostly non-Jews. They would all send a relief gift as a symbol of their unity in the Messiah, Jesus. And so many of his churches, they were thrilled to give. But the Corinthians, in the midst of all this conflict with Paul, hadn't saved up for the gift. And for Paul, this isn't just about money. It's another sign that the Corinthians have not been transformed by the gospel about Jesus, which at its heart is a story of generosity. Paul says, "You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus the Messiah, that even though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich." He's telling the story of the gospel through financial metaphors. Jesus gave up his glorious honor or wealth, and he lowered himself to die like a poor slave, so that other people who are impoverished through sin and death can be exalted and become wealthy through the riches of God's grace. To be a Christian is to let this story sink deep into your mind and heart, letting it transform you into someone who's more generous, more willing to share your life and resources to help others. In the final section of the letter, Paul focuses on the main source of his conflict with the Corinthians, that group of impressive leaders that he sarcastically calls super apostles. So they came to Corinth promoting themselves and bad-mouthing Paul as a poor, unsuccessful leader. And at the risk of sounding self-promoting, Paul says, do these guys really want to compare credentials? He can totally take them on. Are they Jewish Bible experts? Well, so is Paul. He was a Pharisee, for goodness sakes. He has the whole Bible memorized. Do they want to brag about their superior knowledge of Jesus? Paul has actually seen and hung out with the risen Jesus. He's actually had visions of Jesus' heavenly throne room. But more importantly, Paul has given his entire life to the mission of Jesus. He sacrificed comfort and stability, and he never asked the Corinthians for money. Unlike the super apostles who charged a lot, Paul earned his own living. But, Paul says, he refuses to brag about these accomplishments because these aren't the things that really matter as a Christian. Instead, what he'll brag about is how flawed and how weak he is, because it's in those inadequacies that he discovers the love and mercy of Jesus. Or as Jesus once told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect through weakness." Paul concludes the letter with a sober warning to the Corinthians. They need to check themselves. Their contempt for Paul, his way of life, their love for these super apostles, it all shows that they don't grasp who Jesus is on a fundamental level. They're not living like transformed followers of Jesus, and so he invites them once again to humble themselves before the love of Jesus. 2 Corinthians gives us a really unique window into the life of Paul and the paradox set before us by the cross of Jesus. The cross challenges our values, our ways of seeing the world. We value success, education, wealth, but God values humility and weakness because his love and power were made known through the suffering, death, and the resurrection of Jesus. The cross also unleashes the transforming power and presence of the Spirit to empower Jesus' followers to take up his cruciform way of life and make it their own. And that's what 2 Corinthians is all about.
Okay. So much packed into that we're going to unpack here. But I'm just amazed at how much our current day situation feels an awful lot like that. It feels like he's naming this aspect of humanity So these are the people. This is Paul's church. Paul started this church. He knocked on doors and he started a church. And then he went away, and then they wrote him a letter and said, hey, why should we follow you? Like, what are your credentials? And he's like, are you kidding me? What are my credentials? You. Like, you want a letter of recommendation? You are my letter of recommendation. I tell other people about you, about the church that we started there. And it's because the people have been wooed away from Paul's message to these people that he jokingly, sarcastically calls super apostles, which sounds just like evangelical mega church pastors preaching prosperity gospel. It sounds just like that. It's just kind of humbling in not the nicest way to see that our culture 2,000 years later, as evolved as we think we are, we're in this same spiral. We're in this same idea of like, okay, we're going to call ourselves Christians, but are we going to engage in the Jesus way? Meaning, are we going to humble ourselves? Are we going to find ourselves in the power of weakness? Or are we going to try and manipulate the Bible to make personal gain? Well, that just hit me right between the eyes when I was hearing it today. And I don't know about you, but I think a call back to the Christian life is just what I was looking for this week as I was sort of putting this all together. I think we're at this sort of turning point in the pandemic. It feels right now like a lot of us are planning 2021. We're thinking about positive things. There's newness to it. There's change coming in a national way, on sort of a national level, and there's change on a pandemic. There's change coming on a new horizon of vaccine. That's a whole new, different kind of vaccine. It feels like there's light at the end of the tunnel. I'm telling you, that light's far away, but there's light there. And we had a meeting here at church just the other week about how we're targeting the 1st of September as like a big thing, right? The 1st of September could be a big deal in the life of this church and all church. Kids going back to school and, just wait to see all that we have planned. And I just have to tell you, I'm just hopeful. And so as I start to re-gear, as I start to realign, if somebody says the word pivot to me one more time, I'm going to lose it. If I start to recalibrate my life for, okay, now I have somewhere to go, right? I have something to set my eye on. Right now feels like an excellent time to realign myself with the gospel, right? I imagine that this Bible study in 2 Corinthians is like going to see a physical therapist, right? It's a realignment, or a chiropractor, or what have you, or going to yoga to recenter yourself in what it means to follow Jesus of Nazareth. And in our age of Christianity, I just don't think you can do that too much. Once a week is maybe enough, but twice a week, because it's so countercultural. There's power in our weakness. Just that statement alone is incredibly countercultural to everything else we hear out there, where bigger is better and newer is better. And you shouldn't count on anybody, right? The financial advice. We're going to talk about money here tonight. The financial advice that everyone always tells you is, a big moat around it, right? So that you can't be touched. Actually, the power of money is that we can network, right? No moats, being together, combining our resources. And I'm always amazed by financial planners. There's several times in my life when I've thought about becoming a financial planner. It's something that I enjoy doing. And I'm always amazed that the first question that's asked is, how much money do you make? How much money do you have to work with? Okay? No financial advisor has ever asked me, how much money do you need? How much money do you need? Because we all know that number's a lot smaller than the number of how much money do you make. How much money do you need, right? There's power in the smallness. I had this little girl in my Sunday school class years and years ago, and she said, I get it when you say that your God is so big. But my God is so small, she said. My God is in the butterflies and in the anthills. My God is so small in all the little details, not just some big power, but little power too. So Paul is fighting against all these mega preachers. His people have started to follow all these good-looking preachers out there, and Paul's going, okay, you're right. Maybe I'm not that impressive, but the only thing I would ever boast in is the gospel, that I know how to follow Jesus. I know how to find the power of weakness, and I think that's really important for us to look at Paul, to look at this letter and retool ourselves, realign ourselves. All right, so Paul is really upset in this letter. His whole people turn on him, right? If you've ever felt betrayed before, you know that level of upsetness is so much deeper and darker than just, somebody's mad at me or something. Feeling betrayed is a really deep, dark way of being upset. And things haven't been going well for a long time, and it starts to strain the relationship with Paul. And so Paul draws them back using the gospel. And, I think we all do this in our relationship. Even when we're fighting with our friends or, our family, if we realign ourselves both to the truth, we can do so much, right? We can do so much. And so he starts this letter by saying, I urge you to reaffirm your love to him, to Jesus Christ. If we find ourselves both realigning, if we're both tuning to the same message, then we're going to be on it, right? We're both going to be there together. If we both use the same source, the same foundation. And there's this beautiful line in the second chapter where he says we have this treasure in clay jars. And it's kind of this throwaway line. And for a lot of people who studied the Bible, just kind of really loved it, right? If you listen to Christian music in the 90s, there was a band called Jars of Clay that we listened to like a lot. And the idea of a treasure in clay jars is such an excellent metaphor for the gospel. Because a clay jar is not, this is a fancy clay jar. This is not what we're talking about, right? What they're talking about is something really earthy. It's really earthen. It's form follows function, not style, right? And it's unimpressive, and anything boring could be inside of it. But what the Hebrew people did was when they wrote a new manuscript, and they needed to keep it hidden, because every time they got conquered, someone would come into their sanctuary and burn everything to the ground. They would take their most precious sacred texts and hide them in plain sight in ordinary clay jars. And they would put those jars in caves. And they'd put a little stopper on them, because they knew that they were so unassuming that they might actually survive. And it worked, right? I think the most beautiful thing about this metaphor is that it worked, that up until the 1950s, the earliest documents, I think I'm getting that date right, the earliest documents we had were like from the 300s CE, right? But in the 1950s, we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what were the Dead Sea Scrolls? But a bunch of ancient texts, precious vehicles of truth, of love and sacrifice and power and weakness and theology of the cross, precious pieces of this truth were wrapped up and put in clay jars and put in the mountains there in Egypt. And we found those Dead Sea Scrolls, and those immediately became the oldest manuscripts in the world. And it was because they weren't gaudy, they weren't flashy, right? Because you would think that the most sacred things that you have would have to be kept out of sight, out of the way for people to come and marauders and people and kids to put their fingers on it and all kinds of stuff, right? When you think about like the way the Constitution is housed now, I'm just making this up, but, bulletproof glass and, 8 inches thick. And at night it lowers into a vault that's, 10 feet, of concrete on either side. You can't get to it. It's motion censored. Ocean's 11 would have a tough time getting it, right? When we think about the most precious texts, we think that we have to guard them like that. But Paul says, actually what God does is put these precious treasures in collapsible, eco-friendly clay jars. And it becomes a beautiful metaphor here in a minute. So let's hold on to that. And then he talks about this sort of quiet endurance. I'm really not sure why that picture showed up that way. Oh, that's an odd transition from Canva to PowerPoint or ProPresenter. He talks about a quiet endurance. And so I'm going to read this to you really slowly because I want it to sink in. This next slide here, go ahead and make that full screen, Justin. I'm just going to read this to you slowly, like a lectio divina kind of thing. Just let it resonate with you. As servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, in great endurance, in troubles, hardships, and distresses, in beatings, imprisonments, and in riots. Gosh, that sounds like 2020. In hard work, sleepless nights, and hunger. In purity and understanding, patience and kindness. In the Holy Spirit and in sincere love. In truthful speech and in the power of God, with weapons of righteousness in the right hand and in the left, through glory and dishonor, in bad repute and good repute, genuine, yet regarded as impostors. Gosh. Known, yet regarded as unknown. Dying, and yet we live on. Gosh, that sounds a lot like 2020. Beaten, and yet not killed. Sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. I say that to every preacher I talk to. What you bring on Sunday has to be good news. It has to be good news. If you can't find the good news, you shouldn't preach. Poor, yet making many rich. Having nothing, and yet possessing everything. Go ahead and leave that up there, Justin. I would love it if you're paying attention and you would like to put into the chat a part of this that just struck to you. I'd like to have this. I mean, if we were in the room, this would be a very unstructured time, but I would love to hear just what stood out to you. Of course, clay jars aren't the thing that have precious things in them all the time. And yet, these scriptures, this gospel lesson, this understanding of Christ is like something great that's been put in the jar. Right? It's sorrowful, but always rejoicing. It's poor. It's not special. And yet, the gospel makes many rich. Not prosperity gospel rich, but like rich in that you have a good life, that you have joy and meaning in your life, having nothing and yet possessing everything. You can flip that back to the present moment, thanks. It's almost like Paul's saying, we are those clay jars. We are the vehicle. And what we carry is precious as the gospel. That my life is my story is part of his story, right? History, right? My life is a small fragment of the body of Christ, of the life of the body of Christ, that my work is part of the work of the kingdom of God. It's almost like our earthen bodies are these clay jars that are easily breakable, but and sometimes unimpressive, but that can hold so much. And the quiet endurance that Paul's talking about is something that we all experience. It's that whole adage that doesn't quite get it, that says, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, actually, some things make you weaker. And then the next thing can get you. But the idea behind what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is this quiet endurance that we can go through many, many things. And it's by going through them that we appreciate how much we've always had. You got a comment? Yeah.
Yeah, we've had a couple comments in the
Great.
chat, and I thought it's just important. People pointing out pieces of the passage that they really liked.
Yeah.
Katie Wu said, having nothing and yet possessing everything.
Yes. So let's stick there for just a second. Yes, having nothing and yet possessing everything. And one of the most bizarre secrets of the world is that poor people are happier than rich people. That something about having nothing makes you appreciate people and relationship. And what we really want in life is right relationship with each other and with God, not stuff. The stuff is a distraction. The furniture gets in the way of the relationship, right? Yeah. What's the next one?
Heidi said just the words "and yet."
And yet, one of the things I love about this passage too is it's not quite clear to me where the turn is, right? Where does it go from being all bad things to good things? And there's no one marker, right? There's no what, like Romans 8 we love because, not height, nor depth, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor anything else in all of creation can separate us from the love of God. It's a list that ends, right? Or earlier in 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient and kind. It's not envious or boastful or rude. It isn't arrogant. It doesn't exist. And so it's like all self-contained. But this is life. This is real. There's endurance. There's troubles. There's hardships. And then there's purity and understanding and patience and kindness. And there's the Holy Spirit. And there's true speech. And then there's weapons. And then there's dishonor and bad report and good report. And some things are genuine and some things are imposters. And it just feels so real. So the and yet is the hope, right? It's that sense that the gospel is calling us toward wholeness, toward completeness, toward reconciliation and right relationship. And that the bad news is never the entire news, which is really frustrating if you follow the news because it's almost always bad. Are there more?
Yeah, Peggy had two. She said, as servants of God, and then in love and patience.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Peggy. The word that shows up here as patience is like it's the kind of patience. I got to get this right. It's the kind of patience that you have with a child when the child's not getting it. It's like a specific word in Greek that means I've told you 10 times and you keep telling me that you got it right and you did it wrong again. Like it's a patience for people. It's like I was just thinking about my cousin. I have a sweet cousin. And she's a special ed teacher, and just the patience with which she does her work, and we've talked, it's ministry. It really is ministry. It's really ministry. That level of patience, woo! Some people have it, and most of us don't. And but it's this life. This is life right here, and sometimes you don't feel like you have that patience, but you still wait it out. This too shall pass. Like all things, this will pass. Are there any more?
Yeah, we have one more from Larry Wu. He said, poor yet making many rich.
Yes. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit because it is so often those who feel like they don't have much to give who make everything, rich. And, one of the things from the pandemic that I've really enjoyed is spending that time with my family where we had to invent new things, right? We have to have new family time because we've done all the things that we know how to do. And that's just been really great to sort of do that in a new way. I remember I got down my comic books one day and showed them to my kids, and they couldn't believe that I was into Marvel before they were, and we just sort of have this whole other thing, and some of that is because we felt impoverished. We felt like we were being held back from the things we wanted to do. We wanted to be out in pandemic and go see movies. And when we couldn't do that, we had to dig deeper. And when we dug deeper, we actually found a richness there. Yeah, it's almost like we are the clay jars, he says. And I think that's a really good way to think about yourself. Sometimes we beat ourselves up for all the wrong reasons. Oh man, I should be perfect. No, you shouldn't. No, you shouldn't. No human being has ever done everything right, save Jesus of Nazareth. The idea of perfection is a lie that we tell ourselves, and I don't know why we do. Whenever somebody messes up, they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot your name. You're like, no, that happens to everybody. That happens to everybody all the time. Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm late. That happens to everybody. Oh my gosh, I forgot our meeting today. That happens to everybody, right? Give yourself some grace. You're just like this clay jar, and the most valuable thing you hold is the gospel. It's good news for somebody else. So rather than striving to always be on time and always be prepared and always be perfect, why don't you just try to tell the gospel? Why don't you just try to transport the gospel message wherever you go? Sing wherever you go, Justin. Sing wherever you go. Then we get to this part in chapter 9 that's about money. And I just want to talk to you about this strictly from a theological perspective here. I'm not asking you for your money. I want you to know that generosity is a clear indicator that you're living the good life. You don't have to go tell everybody. There was this guy that he had this car, and I just saw it everywhere that said I tithe, and it said license plate. And I was just like, great. You don't have to rub it in anybody's face. That's not what it's about. But generosity is a symptom of the good life. It just is. And he says, whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And that's just true, right? The more crops you plant, the more crops you harvest. You will not harvest more crops than you planted. That's not a thing. That's not going to happen. And then he says, each of you should give what you have dedicated in your heart to give. And he says, I don't want you to do this reluctantly or under compulsion. Don't give because somebody's twisting your arm or something like that. Give what you've decided in your heart to give. For God loves a cheerful giver. And I just want you to think about that part in conversation with you are a jar of clay, right? You just hold the gospel. And when you hold the gospel, generosity is just a natural, free-flowing thing. It's for some of us that's easier than others, right? I think that we should name that there's a looseness to some people's wallets, and there's a tightness of other people's wallets. I suppose that would be the opposite. And just know who you are, right? And know who you are, and align yourself or talk with someone who's opposite you, so you can find some commonality there. Not everybody's a give away everything kind of person, and I get that, right? I lived with parents who were reckless in their generosity, right? So I came home from college one day and my bed was gone. Dad came home from work one day and the washing machine was gone. Mom just gave stuff away. It was, she has a great heart for that. And we're not all that way. But whatever generosity is in your context, I think you ought to find a way to align yourself to that. And you've heard me say before probably that the paradox is if you have $10 and somebody asks you for a really needy cause for $1, you're going to give it to them. It's just $1, right? But if you've got $100,000 and somebody comes to ask you for $10, now you're really reluctant to give that up. But that's a paradox because when you only had $10, you needed that dollar you gave. But when you have $100,000, you don't need that $10,000. I tell young people all the time, the difference between a $400 couch and a $4,000 couch is not much. And yet somehow we treat it that way. Okay. And God is able to bless you abundantly. And the mindset of generosity is a mindset, right? Generosity is a mindset. It's not one of scarcity. It's one of abundance. And the gospel is so clearly abundant in that it multiplies. The things that are good in your life multiply when you're in the gospel, right? Goodness multiplies in the gospel. When you're generous and somebody else is generous with you, you don't need to build a big moat around it. You know who builds a big moat around them? People who don't share because they're afraid of how everyone else is going to treat them, right? People who share, people who are generous, don't need a moat because every other person around them's got their back. We network each other, right? That some of the greatest nonprofit organizations in the world are when we put together our money from mutual funds, right? Like Thrivent, mutual funds, because we say, okay, we're all going to share the risk and the responsibility together. And it's really a beautiful thing. God has blessed you abundantly, and that's just true. It doesn't matter your financial setting or anything. You need to know that you've been blessed. You need to feel that you've been blessed. And if you don't feel like you've been blessed, we need to do some more soul work for you. We need to see deeper into you so that you can feel that blessing because you have been born on this gorgeous planet. And you've been born in a pretty good time and in a pretty good place on that planet. And so that abundance for your life should abound in everything that you do. One of the greatest books I've ever read, y'all know I like to read some books, is this one. It's called The Soul of Money. I couldn't find it on my shelf. You know what that means? I lent it to somebody and never came back. But I found the article that's part of this, and we're going to put it in the chat right now. Justin's got that for you. Well, I'm just going to read this to you. This is from The Soul of Money by Lynn Twist. And the story right before this one is that she was in a high-rise in Minneapolis. She was raising money for the Hunger Project. And she was in a high-rise in Minneapolis and with this big executive, and she just got this huge check of $50,000. And then she says, I learned a lot about money from a woman named Gertrude. I met Gertrude in a church basement in Harlem. I was doing a small fundraising event for the Hunger Project. I had come from Minneapolis, where I had met with an executive of a large company. The company had an image problem and felt that making a donation to the Hunger Project and being seen to support the end of hunger might help clean up its image. The executive I met with had given me a check for $50,000, but he made the donation basically to get me to go away as a PR stunt, to assuage his guilt about some public mistakes the company had made, and to have the company look good for their stock prices and in the eyes of the public. I could tell in the interaction that we had that he had no real interest in connecting himself with resource poor people, or in any way, make any kind of difference in the world to end world hunger. The money was given from guilt, and the guilt that was passed along with the money. I now felt guilty for receiving it. I had received the money and the guilt, and both he and I were both unfulfilled. I had that $50,000 check in my briefcase, which sat behind me on a table in the basement of that Harlem church. There were 75 gathered before me. All of them were black. It was raining, and there were leaks all over the room we were in. There were buckets strategically placed all around us, catching the dripping water, and there was a constant background noise of the rain outside and the dripping from the leaking walls and ceiling. I looked out at the audience, and that I knew were people sitting there did not have much to give. I spoke to them about the Hunger Project's work in Africa, and I thought it would be the most relevant to their lives and their heritage. When it came time to ask for donations, my palms were sweating, and I began to perspire, all of wondering if it was even the right thing to do. I went ahead and made the request, and the room was absolutely silent. After what seemed like a long, long time, a woman named Gertrude stood up. She was sitting on the aisle in the second row from the back. She was in her late 60s or early 70s. She had gray hair, and when she stood up, she was tall, thin, erect, and proud. She said, "I ain't got no checkbook. I ain't got no credit cards. To me, money is a lot like water. For some folks, it rushes through their life like a raging river, but the money comes through my life like a small trickle. But I want to pass it on its way that does the best good for the most folks. I see that as my right and my responsibility. It's also my joy. I have $50 in my purse that I earned from doing a white woman's wash, and I want to give it to you." She walked up the aisle and gave me her precious $50. And at that moment, I saw the power of money in a new way. I knew that the $50 I received from Gertrude would buy more for the end of hunger than the $50,000 check in my briefcase. I knew that the $50 was money that came from the soul and not from a bank account. I saw that the power of money can be seen in the way we use it and the integrity with which we direct it into the world. Gertrude taught me a great lesson, and I never forgot it. As Gertrude tells us, we can look at money like water. It flows all over the planet, and everywhere it goes, it's useful. It makes things happen, and it's passed along. We can't say that water doesn't belong to any of us. It belongs to all of us. When water is flowing and moving, it cleanses, it purifies, it makes things green, it creates growth, it nurtures. But when water starts to slow down, it's held back and stands still. It can be toxic and stagnant to those who hold it. All of this can be true of money. It's possible to have money flow in a way that serves our highest ideals and commitments rather than accumulate it so that we can gain power, authority, or special privileges. Money can bear the mark of he or she who passed it on, and in many ways can be voice, expression, and commitment. I read that for the first time, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, and I was enamored with the fact that money is a lot like water. And just to tell you a little bit more about that story and about the book, in case you don't get, if you do buy it and you read it, you can find it's called The Soul of Money. You can find it on Amazon. Why don't you consider buying it and then donating it to my personal library? Because mine's gone. After you read it, mine's gone. We'll put it back. That story of the CEO and the $50,000 check continues. She says, after I got that $50 from Gertrude and some of the other women who were in the room, I took that $50,000 check and I tore it up. She said, I called that CEO and I said, we don't want your money. We don't want your guilt money. That CEO called her 2 years later and said, you're in my head. I cannot believe you ripped up a check for $50,000. He said, what I want to do is quit my job and come work for you. And he did. Money's only as powerful as it does good. And money that does evil gets lost of its power. Because its power is to help things grow like water. If you keep it stagnant, it's not going to be any good. Money is supposed to flow down, right? My whole childhood was talked about trickle-down economics. But if people hold it, it doesn't trickle down. But generosity is when you just let the water flow. You can't contain it. You let it flow. And you let it do more good out there. And you lend it, and you give it, and you let it, you put it toward special projects so that it can do special things. And when you live your life that way, you see a lot of things start to grow. I'm just telling you, generosity is such an important part of the good life. And if you haven't found that part, let's move an inch. How can we move an inch on this today? What can we give to? What can we be generous with? Back to Paul. Paul starts to talk about a thorn in his flesh. He says that's a picture of a thorn. I don't know. Can you tell that that's a picture of a thorn? I can't tell. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults and in hardships, in persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Siblings in Christ, it's been such an honor to go through these Corinthians with you and to land tonight on this pivotal, so important message from God. Our strength looks like puffed up wisdom, but our weakness looks like prayer and humbleness and meekness. And Jesus says those are the people who are blessed. I know most of us probably have more money than we need. We spent money on things that we didn't need. But I'm just here to tell you, in our weakness is where God does the most good, because we just know this to be true. The first step always starts with admitting that there's a problem. And that's what weakness is. Admitting that there's a problem. When we admit that we are not perfect, when we admit that we don't have it all, when we don't understand it all, we don't feel it all, we don't say it all, we don't do it all, we fall short of the glory of God. When we start a worship service here at Christ the King, we start it with confession. We confess that we cannot free ourselves. We sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. We have not loved you with our whole heart. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. When we confess to God, when we prostrate ourselves before God in our weakness, when we are empty, that's when Christ can fill us up. That is when we do our best work. Not when we're high and mighty, but when we're lowly and needy. When our hands are empty is when we can grab somebody else's hand. When we work together, when we build community, when we give like Gertrude did, even when we don't have much. This is a 12-step program. I'm sure you can't read all of those. You don't really need to read all of them. But you know what the 12 steps are. And the thing that blows people's mind about the 12 steps is that there was no scientific basis for it. No one ever thought it was going to work except for Bill. No one thought that this thing was going to work. But what the 12 steps allow people to do is admit their weakness, align themselves with a higher power, and start to reconcile their life with those that they have hurt. The 12-step program is confession and forgiveness. It is death and resurrection. It is a thorn in the side, and my grace is sufficient for you. We would all do well to follow the 12-step program in all aspects of our lives, whether it's an addiction or whether it's just unhappiness, right? Whether it's just a tough marriage or a tough time with our kids, or God, raising our parents is exhausting, you know, and everything. Whether it's a situation at work or whether it's just a love of money that's unhealthy, whether it's that we're overweight, whatever our problem is, the 12 steps could help us by realigning us and seeking reconciliation. It's confession and forgiveness. You want to follow all those mega preachers out there? Go ahead. You won't get it. You won't get the gospel. You won't have it just by gaining wealth. There's just true. Some of the richest people in the world are the least happy because they're not in relationship, and that's what we so crave. This is my last slide for y'all, I think. Yep. When Paul says the words that Jesus said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you," I felt a rush of God's goodness in me when I read that again today. My grace is sufficient for you. And that gift, that thing that grace grows for us, is reconciliation, which is what we want most in this world. We want to be reconciled. That's why we have therapists. That's why we have preachers. That's why, that's why we have all of these people and places in order to help us reunite. What we want more than anything is to feel part of a community and feel whole. Ashley will tell you, I love watching all of the documentaries about like the world, like Earth or planet or animals or whatever, because they're so true. They name our truth in a way that we don't, right? Because we put on makeup for the cameras. They just live, right? And I was just watching this yesterday with my daughter, Avery. There was this whole pack of, it's a kind of monkey in Japan. And they're all sitting in this hot spring. they're all hanging out in the jacuzzi. And they all know that they have to make friends before nighttime. Because if they don't huddle up together, they won't make it. And so you watch this one animal go up to each of them and try to pick off, grooming is how you make friends. And no one will let him be his friend, but he just keeps trying. And eventually someone lets him be his friend. And then when the night gets cold, he snuggles up next to them, and they all survive. Like the pack of like 5 or 6 males all survived because they needed that extra one. It got so cold at night that what they needed was community and friendship. And when your goal is reconciliation, you'll find joy in a way that the world can't give that to you. God gives that to you. Grace is sufficient for you because there wasn't anything that you were ever missing. You know what you need to live. You don't need an inordinate number of things or big places. What you need is community. What you need is people and reconciliation. And when we do each other wrong, we have to start over with our 12 steps, right? We must seek again. One of the things that was a big moment for me in my life was when I stopped feeling like I had to be enough. I really don't like the word enough, right? A lot of people walk around saying, you are enough, right? You should feel enough. Everyone is enough. But even saying you are enough is predicated on the idea that there's an amount that you need to be and you're over it, right? There's a threshold and you are enough. So I started a couple of years ago with my own mantra, which is you are adequate. And that just cracks me up. I just laugh about it all the time. I walk around and say, Daniel, you are adequate, right? Because it's not like special or cool or amazing or like above average. But it also doesn't have that sense of like, you have to be enough. You are adequate. Grace is sufficient for you. And I just hope and pray that these texts continue to come alive for you, that 2 Corinthians continues to show you what the Christian life is about. It's about endurance through hardship. It's about the and yet of all of the bad things in life mixed with all of the good things. You'll never untangle them. They'll always be good and bad in our lives. It's about being generous. That's the good life. And it's about seeking reconciliation, which will bring you more joy than any other endeavor in your life. I promise you. More than that promotion, more than that car or that house, more than the perfect family, 2.7 kids or whatever. Seek reconciliation, and you will find grace. So, siblings in Christ, that's it. Thanks for such a great year of me talking to Justin and the camera. We're all going to get through this. We're going to get through this, and we're going to do it because we have community. And if you know somebody who needs community, why don't you introduce them to CTK? There's enough room for them too. Good night, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to Bible study.